All right. Well, it looks like we have a really wonderful number of people who've already joined. And so I want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lori Cohen, CEO of PACT, which stands for Protect All Children from Trafficking. We're so grateful to have you with us for what promises to be a powerful and very necessary conversation. PACT was founded in 1991, 35 years ago, as ECPAT USA, and we hold the distinction of being the first organization in the United States dedicated entirely to raising awareness and driving action to end the commercial sexual exploitation of children. We began with advocacy around what was then referred to as sex tourism, working to ensure that Americans who travel overseas to purchase sex with minors could be prosecuted right here in the United States for those crimes. Over the decades, our work has grown and deepened. We focus on youth and community, education, private sector engagement, including partnerships with the hotel and travel industries, and legislative advocacy. We don't just raise awareness, we work to prevent the sexual exploitation of children. In 2023, we renewed our commitment by changing our name to PACT, Protect All Children from Trafficking, a name that reflects both who we are and the promise we make to every child. And we are proud to serve as the U.S. member of ECPAT International, a global network of anti-trafficking organizations in more than 100 countries, all united by one mission: to eliminate the sexual exploitation of children worldwide. That membership connects our domestic work to a global movement, and it is what brings us into conversation with the United Nations today. Which brings me to the context of this webinar. Next week marks the opening of the 70th session of the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations, a milestone gathering that also follows by just 1 year the 30th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, where the landmark Beijing Platform for Action was adopted. That platform remains, 3 decades on, the most comprehensive global framework for advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. It has guided governments, civil society, and international bodies ever since. And though new areas of concern have been added to the CSW's deliberations over the years, the platform's blueprint endures. This year, CSW's priority theme is ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls, including by promoting inclusive and equitable legal systems, eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and addressing structural barriers. For PACT, that theme lands with particular urgency because when we talk about access to justice in the context of child trafficking, we are talking about children, often girls, though not exclusively, who are among the most marginalized people in our society. Children who have been exploited, who have been treated as criminals rather than victims, who have faced court systems that were not designed with them in mind. We are talking about structural failures in how the law has seen or failed to see trafficked children. Children make up 38% of all trafficking victims worldwide, and that number is almost certainly an undercount. In the United States alone, hundreds of thousands of minors are estimated to be at risk of commercial sexual exploitation at any given time. And yet, far too often, when these children come into contact with the justice system, they are re-victimized by it, arrested, prosecuted, stigmatized, left without the services they desperately need. Our panel today will explore why that happens, how the system must change, and what it looks like when justice actually works for trafficking survivors. I'm honored to introduce the extraordinary voices who will guide this conversation, representing the survivor community and the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, as well as federal and state expertise. Our first speaker is Chantal Lafon, a trafficking survivor, a fierce advocate, and a member of PACT's Survivors Council. Established in 2017, the Survivors Council is central to everything PACT does because we believe that the people with lived experience of exploitation hold unique expertise that must inform policy, programs, and practice at every level. Chantal will speak candidly about the barriers trafficking survivors face when they try to access justice, the fears, the systemic failures, and what meaningful support actually looks like from the perspective of someone who has lived it. Her voice is not a supplement to this panel. It is our foundation. Our second speaker is Aram Sheveh, PACT's Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations. Aaron leads PACT's engagement with federal and state policymakers and brings deep expertise in the legislative and policy landscape affecting trafficking survivors. He will examine what legal and policy reforms are needed and what progress has already been made in expanding access to justice for survivors of child trafficking, including through vacator statutes and survivor-centered protections that ensure children are treated as victims, not offenders. Our third speaker is the Honorable Fernando Camacho, a New York State judge whose career has been defined by a profound commitment to justice for exploited youth. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, Judge Camacho earned his undergraduate degree from Columbia College and his law degree from Fordham Law School. After more than a decade as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, including in the Sex Crimes and Homicides Unit, he has served on the bench since 1997. In 2003, he created what became the spark for New York's human trafficking intervention courts, now operating throughout the state, a specialized treatment court designed to stop the incarceration and re-victimization of trafficking victims in the criminal justice system. He later created the Erin Court, the first specialized court in New York State to provide support and services for sexually exploited youth and family court, and he created the Concepts Court, an adolescent diversion court for young people charged as juvenile delinquents and persons in need of supervision. Judge Camacho will speak to what access to justice looks like and what it must look like from inside the courtroom. I'm also proud to add that Judge Camacho is a just wonderful member of PACT's board of directors, and I'm so pleased that PACT has such tremendous expertise on our board. Our fourth speaker is Ambassador Cindy Dyer, a human rights advocate and attorney with more than 30 years of experience working at the local, national, and international levels to prevent and respond to human trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Ambassador Dyer served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons from 2023 to 2025, unanimously confirmed by the Senate after being nominated by President Biden. In that role, she led America's global engagement on human trafficking, engaging with government officials in 20 countries across every region of the world. She previously served as director of the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Justice Department, confirmed by the Senate during the Bush administration, and as vice president for human rights at Vital Voices Global Partnership, where she worked with civil society leaders in more than 25 countries. Ambassador Dyer now serves as Chief Program Officer of the McCain Institute. She will close our panel by exploring what the United States can teach the world about access to justice for trafficking victims, and, critically, what we still have to learn from other countries. Together, these four perspectives, survivor advocate, policy wonk, jurist, and diplomat, form exactly the kind of multidimensional conversation that meaningful change requires. The Beijing Platform for Action called on all of us, governments, civil society, the private sector, and international institutions, to act. 30 years later, the 70th Commission on the Status of Women asks us to take stock of where we stand and recommit to where we must go. Today's panel is PACT's answer to that call. We invite you to listen deeply and ask hard questions. After the panelists' initial presentations, I'll invoke my moderator's prerogative and ask a few questions of our speakers, but the bulk of this conversation will be initiated by you. You can submit questions using the Q&A box, and I'll choose some of those to ask members of our panel. At the end of our 90-minute event, I hope you have a more complete understanding of the challenges of and solutions to access to justice for minor trafficking victims. I invite you to carry what you hear today into your own work and communities, because every child deserves to grow up free from exploitation, and every survivor deserves a justice system that sees them, believes them, and stands with them. Let's begin with Chantal Lafon. Chantal, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Chantal Lafon, and I must say it's an honor to be within this space with everyone here today. I want everyone to know, first and foremost, that this is not abstract, this is real, this is personal, and well overdue. As a trafficking survivor and someone who lived maneuvering through the system this panel is trying to fix, I am here as a lived experience expert. My knowledge does not come from textbooks nor policy brief, but from surviving the justice system that I was a victim and a defendant. I was trafficked and forced to transport drugs under the threat of violence to myself and my family. Traffickers routinely exploit their victims for economic gain through illegal activities. In 1999, believe it or not, I was arrested and convicted possession with intent to distribute. The Virginia courts saw a defendant when they should have seen a victim. After escaping nearly 2 decades later, my trafficker was finally arrested and convicted. Though the conviction was victorious, but the record was still there. A reminder that the law punish the victim alongside the predator. The world assumes we're free, right? But a criminal record for crimes committed under force is a sentence. Every background check, every job application, every housing application, every attempt to rebuild your life, my life, our life, the record is there. The bars are invisible, but they are there. That is what it means to live in a jail without bars. The record makes survivors afraid to come forward, afraid of law enforcement, afraid of losing immigration status, and unable to access the system that should protect us. The justice system that was supposed to protect survivors instead used as another weapon against us. And that must change. Enact and expand vacatur and expulsion laws in every state at every level of government. Continue, not saying start, because it's been going on for quite some time, thank God. Continue to train law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges to identify cohorts, criminal activity. So traffickers, survivors are protected and not prosecuted. Remove the cooperation requirements for to vacate a crime and the eligibility for it because not everyone can safely cooperate. Their victimization should be enough proof, living proof. Listen to survivors, please, in designing the laws and the policies that affects us. People who actually lived inside the systems know exactly where the failures are. To everyone in this room, I must say, as tough as Virginia is a model. They pass unanimously because the case for protecting survivors is clear. It is moral and it is overdue. Take that model home with you today. Because, in all honesty, justice is not just the absence of bars, it is the presence of freedom. I thank you so much here today and I pass it. It's an honor once again.
Thank you, Chantal. I just got goosebumps from that last sentence, so I'm trying to write it down and not cry. So thank you. Um, Aram Shivay, it's a tough act to follow, but I'm sure you're up for the challenge.
Thanks so much, Lori, and thank you all to the close to 100 participants that we have here. I'm really honored by your presence, including a number of luminaries from the field and former colleagues. So folks from around the world, thank you so much for being here. It is a tough act to follow. Let me just start with a simple but powerful truth that for trafficking survivors, and especially for children, there is no justice access without the right laws in place. Minor trafficking victims face a justice paradox. They are victims of serious crimes. And as Chantal mentioned, for decades, too many of them have encountered the criminal justice system not as survivors deserving protection, but as suspects facing potential arrest, prosecution, and lifelong criminal records, records that can block them from accessing jobs, housing, education, and even from custody of their own children. The paradox is not an accident of fate. It is a failure of policy, and it can only be corrected through policy, deliberate, survivor-informed, politically sustained lawmaking at the federal and state level. The legislative response to trafficking operates on two parallel tracks that I'd like to cover. First, criminal liability, the laws that define trafficking as a crime, that protect child victims from prosecution, and that hold buyers and traffickers accountable. But equally important, perhaps more important in some ways, is civil liability, laws that give survivors the right to sue in court, to seek damages, and to hold not just their traffickers, but the corporations and institutions that profited from their exploitation financially accountable. Both tracks are essential, and neither alone is sufficient. Our story begins in 2000 with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, landmark legislation. For the first time, federal law defined sex and labor trafficking, established the famous 3P framework of prevention, prosecution, and protection, created the T visa for foreign national survivors, and critically for this panel, made sex trafficking of a minor a federal crime regardless of force, fraud, and coercion. Again, a child cannot consent to being trafficking. TVPA enshrined that principle in federal law. But passing a law is just the beginning. Just as important as implementing it and improving it over time. And subsequent TVPA reauthorizations strengthen criminal protections specifically for unaccompanied minors at the border, requiring child welfare screenings, appointing child advocates, and establishing safe repatriation standards. Other reauthorizations push states towards safe harbor, urging them through funding incentives to treat minor trafficking victims as victims, not criminals, and directing resources towards trauma-informed housing and survivor services. But today, that architecture needs to be renewed. The bill, H.R. 1144, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act, quite a mouthful, is pending in Congress. It would extend these core anti-trafficking programs through 2029, authorize hundreds of millions per year across the government, fund education and employment programs for survivors, and we urge its passage. Without this reauthorization, funding lapses, and the services that minor survivors depend on may be among the first to disappear. Now, I want to go from that to a law that did pass, one that happened just a few weeks ago. Earlier this year, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act was signed into federal law after passing both chambers of Congress unanimously. The law addresses one of the most persistent injustices in our system, that criminal records that traffickers force their victims, including minor victims, to accumulate. Survivors charged with prostitution, with drug offenses, with crimes that their traffickers ordered them to commit. These records follow people for decades, disqualifying them from jobs, housing, student loans, professional licenses, and as I mentioned, even custody of their children. The Trafficking Survivors Relief Act changes that at the federal level. It allows survivors to petition to vacate nonviolent federal convictions tied to trafficking, provides for expungement of arrest records, allows trafficking victim status to be raised as a mitigating factor at sentences, and funds legal representation to help survivors navigate post-conviction relief. This is justice, not just in law, not just in words, but in law. And I should mention, on Chantal's point, that on vacature and expungement, the federal government isn't leading the way. It's actually many years behind the states, the vast majority of which have similar laws. In fact, many of those states are now on the second or even third wave of those laws, improving earlier ones. So as just one example, a bill in Virginia would expand the state's existing vacature process, broadening the set of eligible offenses, covering ancillary charges and arrest records. And it builds on earlier expansions from 2021 and 2025 and potentially can serve as a template for other states. Now let me turn to the civil track, and here too the story begins with TVPA and its reauthorizations. The 2003 and 2008 reauthorizations created a private right of civil action. So for the first time, survivors could sue their traffickers and those who knowingly benefited from trafficking ventures in federal civil court. This is arguably one of the most consequential and least discussed access to justice milestones. And the data tell a compelling story about why these civil remedies matter. And in fact, I saw one of the authors of the report, Martina Vandenberg, who leads the Human Trafficking Legal Center, who has a report that notes that in the first 20 years, survivors filed almost 1,000 cases in federal court, producing nearly 1 billion with a B in publicly disclosed damages, awards, and settlements, which is not even to mention confidential settlements, which are substantial. The surge in sex trafficking civil cases is especially relevant for this panel. Of the cases filed by U.S. citizens through 2023, the majority involving minors, 86% alleged sex trafficking, and over 90% of sex trafficking civil cases named a corporate or institutional defendant. Hotels, internet service providers, financial institutions that knew or should have known that trafficking was occurring in their establishments or on their platform. And I should say, on a personal note, PACT is proud to work with the lodging and transportation industries to educate their staff, from the boardroom to those who clean rooms, on the signs of trafficking and what to do. Looking ahead, another bill, the Stop CSAM Act, would dramatically extend civil liability in the digital space. Pending in Congress, the Stop CSAM Act would, for the first time, give survivors a federal civil right of action to sue online platforms that knowingly or recklessly host child sexual abuse material or facilitate trafficking, piercing the so-called Section 230 immunity that has often shielded platforms from any accountability whatsoever. Let me close with this. Every law and every bill that I've described today represents years of advocacy by survivors, by legal advocates, by researchers, by organizations like PACT, and by champions in Congress and state legislatures. Legislative progress is never automatic. It requires sustained political will, survivor-led voices, and coalitions that refuse to let these issues slip from the agenda. Access to justice is not a destination. It is an ongoing obligation. And we at PACT are committed to fighting for it in Congress, in state legislatures, and at fora like this one, until every child who has been trafficked can find in our legal system not a second victimization, but a path to safety, dignity, and healing. Thank you so much. And with that, let me turn it over to Justice Camacho.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Lori, and thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be part of this just incredible panel. So I want to give you a perspective from the judicial system, specifically the New York State court system, and trace the New York court system's treatment of trafficked youth. Going back to 1985, when I first became a prosecutor in Manhattan DA's office, this following scenario was not uncommon. A 42-year-old father of three would be having sex in a car with a 14-year-old. A police officer from the so-called uncalled public moral squad would come upon the car, and you would think he would arrest the 42-year-old for statutory rape and take the child to the hospital. What would happen was this: officer, please don't arrest me. If you do, my wife's going to leave me. I'm going to lose my job. Please. All right, get out of here. I never want to see you again. The kid would then be placed in a van, transported to central booking, where she would spend 2 days, 48 hours, in a filthy cell, waiting to go before the judge. Once she came before the judge about 2 in the morning, we would play the court system's version of let's make a deal. I, as the prosecutor, junior prosecutor, would say, all right, judge, she's got 6 convictions, 30 days in jail. My friend, the public defender, would say, judge, she's a kid, 10 days. The judge would say, 20 days, take charge. We would look at each other. We knew it was unconscionable. Shame on us. What we didn't know in the courtroom at that point was that that child probably was 12 or 13 when she first got turned out to the life. We did not appreciate, like so many others, she was most likely a runaway or a throwaway who came from a dysfunctional home where she suffered physical and sexual abuse. Young, frightened, scared, she went driven into the arms of a pimp who promised her for the first time in her life friendship, security, and a family. Instead, she was thrust into the hell that is street prostitution. She was put to work on the track, which is a desolate stretch where on any given night she was forced to have sex with a dozen or more total strangers. Some were nice, some were not. If she tried to leave, she was brought back, hunted down, and severely punished. We did not know or appreciate that the day she finished serving that 20-day sentence, she would be right back on the street, right back on the track, with the same pattern of violence, arrest, incarceration, and re-victimization was repeated again and again and again. Shame on us. Fast forward to 1997. I was now a judge. I'm on the bench in Brooklyn. I'm playing my part. The court sentence is 20 days in jail. Let's make a deal. I did it. Continued doing it. Shame on me. Fast forward to 2003. 16-year-old runaway comes into my courtroom. She had been arrested many times for prostitution. Playing the same game, 30 days, 10 days. I'm about to say 20 days when the sky just opened up. And I literally said out loud, what am I doing? That was a moment that actually changed my life. I sent her for services. I did not send her to jail. I never again sent another person to incarceration for prostitution. And that was the spark that led to the creation of the first human trafficking intervention court, working with sexually exploited youth. Since then, we have come a long way. We've established statewide human trafficking intervention courts, which now are in every jurisdiction in New York State, which assist individuals charged with prostitution and other crimes and don't incarcerate them. We have passed extensive legislation, and I won't get into all of it because Aaron has dealt with the federal level, but the same things we're doing at the state level. Enacted a lot of tremendous, extensive legislation that finally recognized the fundamental truth that they're victims, not criminals. Let's support them. Let's not incarcerate them. And we also created recently, as a result of something that was happening, that I saw happening, is in 2026, we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. The track doesn't look the same as it did in 85, but it's still there. It still exists. The traffickers are becoming more brutal. I recently had a 16-year-old in my court. I just started a brand new trafficking court and family court, which is there's a crisis here, and that children, especially children in foster care, are being trafficked. So I started this court. There's a 16-year-old victim in my court who recently had their front teeth pulled out with pliers for not being compliant. We have 12, 13, 14-year-old victims. A 12-year-old child rescued from a hotel, tattoos all over her little body. A child rescued, a 13-year-old child rescued from so-called lingerie parties, where men would sit around on Friday nights. Little girls would walk around in lingerie. There would be price lists up on the wall, and they'd be smoking cigars and drinking alcohol. Despite these challenges, the court system continues to adapt. We've developed specialized courts in family court, because children in foster care are some of the most vulnerable children, individuals who are being commercially sexually exploited every single day. We have 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. In conclusion, how did the change in the New York State courts happen? The answer is simple. Survivor leaders and their advocates, who over the years have worked tirelessly to support and advocate for trafficked youth. Brave, courageous voices. Many of you are on this webinar today. And I am so honored and proud to have worked with you over the years. It was the voices of the survivor leaders and their advocates that compelled the court system to change its approach to commercial sexual exploitation. You educated us. You inspired us. So going forward, during these trying times, the court system must find ways to continue our partnership and strengthen our support for survivor leaders and the organizations that serve trafficked persons. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Ambassador Dyer, it's such an honor to have you participating with us today, and we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be on a panel with such amazing folks, and started off so eloquently by Chantal. So many thanks to all of you. I'm here to represent sort of the global perspective on this. The crime of human trafficking is absolutely a global crime. Not only is it a global crime because it exists in every single country, but it is also a global crime because it actually crosses borders. Now, especially with the onset of the internet, it is facilitated online. There is abuse online, but you can have a victim in one country, a perpetrator in another country, and criminal facilitators in between. And I am so grateful. We often think about human trafficking mostly in terms of sex trafficking and forced labor. I'm so glad that Chantal brought up the really important type of trafficking, which is forced criminality, or an individual who is compelled to commit a criminal act. So how does the United States sort of fit in this? How do we compare with other countries as we are trying to ensure access to justice, as the other panelists have talked about? I think that we actually perform pretty well. One of the things that the United States has, which Aram has talked about, is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And this TVPA has a lot of really good qualities in it. And there are things in this TVPA that other countries can, in fact, sort of learn from. One of the things that's important is that we actually have a law, so that this law extends beyond administrations. We can have a new president, a new administration every 4 years, but this law remains the same. And not every country has that. Sometimes it's the response is really tied to a specific administration. Ours is not. It's really stable, and that has been so important. Additionally, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is really comprehensive. It talks not only about what needs to be at criminal law, it also requires other things. And I'm going to give you a few examples of the things that are in the TVPA, which I think are really good role models for other countries. And I often, when I was serving as the ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. These were the things that I would encourage other countries to do themselves. One is have a law so that you have a durable, consistent policy. The second one, have that law identify one of your departments or ministries who is in charge of coordinating a whole of government response. In the TVPA, the State Department is put in charge, and it is the State Department that must convene the President's Interagency Task Force, which brings the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense, all those ministries together around one table, along with, as my smart new friend Judge Camacho said, with a survivor. We always had at least one representative from our Survivors Council participate in the President's Interagency Task Force. Another thing that our law has, which I think is a really good model, is our TVPA created the requirement that the United States has an advisory council made up of survivor experts, those with lived experience, amazing folks like Chantal, who are part of an organization to provide counsel and advice to the U.S. government in our response to trafficking. And that's why a member of that council participated right at the table next to the Attorney General, and the head of the Department of Health and Human Services was a representative from that Survivors Council. And I really encouraged other countries to have a formalized mechanism for survivor leadership and input into the government actions. Our TVPA also created the Trafficking in Persons Report and requires the U.S. government to assess how are other countries doing. Every other country, 188 countries in the world, and the U.S. government assessed how are they doing in protecting victims, prosecuting cases, and preventing the crime. And another really good example that I think the United States does is we don't rely on the government to provide services. The government needs to pay for the services, but we rely on non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and nonprofits to provide the services. So the U.S. government, through the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, Department of State, we give money to NGOs and civil society organizations, set standards, but let them provide the services. Victims are much more likely to access services and seek that help if the services are provided by a nonprofit rather than provided by the government. But there are absolutely areas where we are not doing a good job. I think that the U.S. does a pretty good job when it comes to obtaining justice. If justice means a conviction, we do have specialized prosecutors and judges like Judge Camacho in our state courts, but also in our federal courts. But where we don't do as good a job is getting victims restitution. A lot of times, what is justice to a victim may not, yes, they might be very happy to have their trafficker convicted, but also they need to be made whole. They need to be reimbursed for all that they have lost. And I think we don't do a good job with our restitution. Sometimes we don't do a good job with offering victims immigration relief so that they can stay here in order to help us get a conviction, and so that they can actually work while they're here so they can afford to support themselves while they stay to help us get a conviction. There are also, I've had an amazing opportunity for a kid from Waco, Texas, who never left the country until she was 30 years old. I have now had an opportunity to travel so many places, and there are some amazing, innovative folks out there, especially in countries that do not have the social safety net that we do in the United States. It's interesting to see the things that they have developed. One of the things that I've seen that other countries have is really innovative programs to help survivors obtain economic empowerment and economic sustainability for themselves. I think in a number of countries, they have amazing programs for helping victims become survivors and then become self-sufficient, and not just in doing something a job that that survivor might not want to do, but a plethora of opportunities, whatever that survivor wants to do. I work with an organization in India, and they offer survivors an ability. You can be a taxi driver, you can be a welder, you can be a security guard, you can be going into dental school. And I think that sometimes other countries do a better job with that. And I think that I really do think it's important that we think about this, addressing this crime at a global level. I live in Virginia. It was funny that Chantal mentioned Virginia. And the two most recent human trafficking convictions at the federal level in Virginia, one was a man who lives in Virginia but was traveling to Colombia to commit his crimes of child sex trafficking. And the other was a man from Canada who was trying to come unsuccessfully, hence the conviction, Canada to Virginia to commit the crime of child sex trafficking. So this is absolutely a global crime. We need to work with our allies and make sure that we have a global response. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I want to thank all our panelists as for getting into the questions, and they are coming in fast and furiously. Chantal, we'll go in order of the speakers. Again, I just want to thank you for sharing what was an extremely difficult time in your life, and I am hopeful that we will see those convictions vacated now and that you are rebuilding your life. And it's just so important that your perspective is shared this is not just about some dry law. This is about human lives ultimately. Um, what, while you were being trafficked, people are always thinking like, what was the trafficking victim thinking? What was going through her mind? I want to ask you, what would you have liked the system to do for you while you were being trafficked? So now we're talking about after the fact and vacating these convictions, but what would have helped you at that time?
Safety. Being if they understood how much danger we're in when you approach us and you want us to give up our trafficker, and we're coming in from another place. We're not from Virginia, we're not from Miami, we're not from these different places, and our traffickers know how to locate us and control us. So if there's no safety, how do you expect us to even help you when we don't even know how to help ourselves because our mental health is not there at that time? We might be in love with our trafficker. We might, think that we're gonna get this grand life and stuff. Woo, but it happens. How are you supposed to tell an officer that you might not trust, right? We have met a lot of those. We might not understand and feel like they do not understand us. We don't see ourselves in them. It might not be a proper dialect. It might be like, leave me alone. I don't care. I don't keep that in mind. But yeah, that's what could have been done different. But I'm happy that at least what's happened then is not what's happening now. So hearing everyone on this panel talk about the rewiring of their mind and being able to be accountable and know that there's something not right out there is a grand gesture of a start and a continuance going forward.
Thank you. It's great advice. And we need to keep safety in mind and realizing how vulnerable a victim is in that moment. And your point is, it's hardly ever is a victim able to step forward and say, "Oh, thank you so much, officer. I was being exploited and I'm ready to have services now." Right? That's not what it looks like. So it's really such an important perspective. Aram, I would be remiss in my role as CEO at PACT if I did not turn to you and say you gave us like a really important list of legislative priorities. What can the people participating in this webinar do to kind of move them forward? And do you have thoughts about like where should they start? I know people always are asking me, what can I do? And now I'm looking at you. What can we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously getting informed is maybe step one, but it can't be the final step because that's not really how things move. I think there's a lot of different ways that folks can get involved. I think, being a concerned citizen, it sounds hackneyed, and I think people sort of, there's so much cynicism about the political system, understandably, and I think justifiably so. But it turns out that lawmakers do actually care what constituents say. Sending them a note is helpful. Calling, old-fashioned way, is better. And if you're able to go to DC or to the local office, every member, in the House and Senate has an office in DC, but they also have home offices, and meet with folks. You probably will not be able to just meet with the member, him or herself, although that sometimes happens. But doing that and then getting your friends to do that makes a difference. It really does. Even a quick call, they log the number of calls they get on different issues. I think it's also, there's just an enormous number of different kinds of initiatives related to human trafficking. I rattled off several of the ones at the federal level. PACT is, tracking several dozen federal bills. At the state level, I pulled up, this is from, Politico Pro, which tracks all the bills. Anyone know how many? Well, I guess it's rhetorical because people can't yell at answers, but I was surprised, and I think you might be surprised too, at how many bills there are at the state level that address human trafficking in current session. It's not 20, it's not 50, it's not 100, it's not 500, it's not 1,000. It's more than that. New Jersey alone has 218 different bills that address human trafficking. New York State has 162. Illinois has 110. So there's an enormous panoply of these different laws. And I think getting a sense of what issue you care about, what makes you angry. That's always a good motivator. And then getting involved directly with members. Obviously, if you have financial resources, sharing those with organizations that do this kind of work on your behalf is something that you can do. But all of those things are really important. I will say what is less impact is just putting something, sort of an angry note on, Instagram or on, X or on Blue Sky is less effective. I think really communicating, not just sort of at large, but to specific legislatures or working with NGOs. And I should say, while PACT is a national NGO and part of this international consortium of NGOs in 110 different countries, there are tons of amazing grassroots NGOs in every community, really from big cities, but also in more rural areas. And many of them have ways that you can get involved. It could be by donating money, it could be by getting trained, it could be by being part of the solution. So lots of different ways. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, definitely this webinar, this virtual panel should make you angry. And if it makes you want to get up and do something, that's good.
Thank you, Aram. And I might add, if people are interested in joining PACT when we are engaging in advocacy on these bills, please feel free to reach out to us. And Aram, is the best way info@wearepact.org?
Yeah, that's our main one. I think there's also policy at wearepact.org.
Okay. So
And of course, people
that will
can just
go
go to our
directly to
website
Aram.
as well. And there's many other organizations as well, of course, as well as PACT. But yeah.
Thank you. Judge, so this was going to be my question to you, and then I noticed that my predecessor, the inimitable Carol Smolinski, had exactly the same questions. So Carol, I'm honored that you and I are thinking along the same lines. So you gave the example of the good husband and father who had to put his pants on and go home to his family, and while the 14-year-old was sitting in jail. And we're all really trying to understand how demand is being addressed, because studies show that demand is a main driver for sex trafficking. And in this case, as you talked about with children, of men sitting around smoking cigars while children are in lingerie. What recommendations do you have on demand, and where do you see this going? What's your sense?
When people ask me, how do we end human trafficking? I say the answer is very simple. You end demand. The problem is that there is this apathy in our community. First of all, it's a very difficult, very, very difficult topic to wrap your brain around. When you hear survivor stories, you cringe, you want to crawl under the table. It hurts. So people would rather avoid it. So what's their attitude then? Their attitude is, like a colleague of mine once said to me, when I'm trying to create the first human trafficking intervention court back in Queens, we're sitting around at lunch. There's a fellow judge. I'm trying to convince him to help. Will you do this in your courtroom? And he says, Fernando, don't you get it? You can't save them. They're prostitutes, almost spitting out a sandwich. How do you break through that mindset, that cruelty, that lack of compassion, lack of empathy? I think the answer is stories. Stories. The stories of survivor leaders. You can't, when you hear a story of a survivor leader, you can't help but be moved. And you know what I would say to that man today, Lori? He's retired and I haven't spoken to him in years. You know what I would say? Hey, Jim, remember that kid who came into my courtroom that you laughed at and said she's a prostitute? I said, well, let me tell you what happened to her, Jim. She went out to college. She graduated. She has a great job. She bought a house. She stays in touch with me. She has an incredible job as a manager of some big company. She has a wonderful 17-year-old son who is in high school, who plays the violin in the high school band and plays football, and I go to his games. And she volunteers in my court. She's about to turn 40. She volunteers in my court. How can you not be moved by that? And you know what they'll say to me, Glory? Well, this is what the buyers say that John said. Well, she was a kid. She was done on her luck. I was trying to give her a couple of bucks to help her out. Shame on you, you hypocrite, you liar.
Yes, I know individuals sometimes think it's a humanitarian aid program, but it comes at the exploitation of a child. So thank you for sharing that story and really reminding us that these are people who have lives and tremendous potential, and it's all of us to try to support that potential. Ambassador, there are going to be many, many questions in the chat for you, but I'm just going to start with one. So don't get nervous. I know you've been grilled by the Senate before, so this should be easy. Um, so you talked about the U.S., like where we were doing well, where we were falling short, and one area that PACT as an organization would be really interested in hearing about is what are your thoughts about prevention, right? So we're often talking about what happens after, someone's been identified as a victim and what victims need, but PACT really believes that if we can move upstream and prevent trafficking from happening in the first place, that could save so many more people. And what might your recommendations be on prevention as we're looking at federal legislation?
I actually think that prevention is one of the hardest issues to address. I was always so glad that it was included not only in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, but also in the Palermo Protocol that we were kind of modeling after. And the more I have worked on this, I actually think that there's not one prevention method that will work. What we know is that there are different vulnerabilities. Children are vulnerable for different reasons, and we have to address those underlying reasons. One of them that Judge Camacho mentioned so eloquently, and I saw this myself when I was a prosecutor in Dallas County. One of the issues is that kids that do not have a safe and loving and stable home will spend more time on the streets. And if they are on the streets, they are. I wanted to like stand up and clap my hands. Judge Camacho, I was a prosecutor in the 90s, and these are young folks. They are looking for love. They're looking for security. They're looking for safety, and they're looking for stability. And until we can offer that safety, security, and stability in their homes, they're going to be out there looking for it elsewhere. But that's not the only type of vulnerability we have. I think another thing that we have to address is, and this, we certainly see this a lot right now, especially with immigration, there are kids that they're very vulnerable to labor trafficking and forced criminality because they are from very economically unstable homes. And they are the ones often who will travel either through regular means of migration or irregular means of migration. And then once they arrive in the United States, their duty is to make money and send that money home to support their families. And so it's a very different, and that's why I say I don't think that there's one type of prevention. I think we have to have sort of a scattershot approach because different kids are vulnerable for different reasons. And I will also say that, to Judge Camacho's good point about demand, not only do we need to address demand for commercial sex, but there's also a demand that the United States has for very, very cheap goods that I can order on my phone and have at my house the next day. And if it seems super, super cheap and it's delivered the next day and it's not, how do you think that is made that cheaply? It's because it is made with forced and child labor. So I'm sorry, but if you're thinking how is it so cheap on Temu and Shein? That, if it looks too good to be true, it is. And so I think that we need to address this much more holistically, because we are a part of that demand, even when we don't intend to be.
Thank you so much. It's such a powerful point that it prevention takes many different forms, and we also need to think about whose exploitation are we preventing. So I thank you for bringing that point home. I will look at these really, I don't even know where to start. There's so many good questions. All right, so Chantal. All right, so this is a question about engaging young people. How do we engage youth? How do we engage teenagers to stand up against child trafficking, right? The trafficking, so many of our trafficking victims, what we talked about earlier, are themselves children, but children can be powerful allies as well. And how can we engage young people?
Well, definitely, we have to make sure we're moving with the times, first and foremost. So we always have to reinvent ourselves and be aware of what's going on out there. Once again, you got to put your ears to the street and stuff. I have my son, and we engage all the time in what's going on. I'm involved, but I still give him healthy space. Due to my past and my consistent healing role, I am able to advise him different, speak to him different. How you feeling? How's your mental health? Who are you on the line with? Oh, have their mother send me their number. I treat him being online as outside. We discuss things when it comes to, it's so hard and it's so sensitive. And like everything that everyone is saying here from the judge to the ambassador is layers. It's layers, it's different levels and stuff is what we're willing to do within ourselves instead of blaming everyone else or thinking that somebody else is accountable. Let's first start by cleaning up our own home so we know how to act and not react, regardless if we like it or dislike it. And we see the bigger picture and we can keep moving forward to get our children involved. My son is aware he could size up when something is not right, when he doesn't feel right. We could discuss things. And I love that because I didn't get that. I was sheltered. I was broken. I was molested. There's so many I. Now I'm able to say, let's do this together. We need to see a better. We need to do things different. We need to, and just keep it moving from there. We need to include the children. They need to know because that way, when they see something happening, they'll be able to say, I learned this. Different. I saw this. I know I need to do something about this. And we could take it from there. It's not going to stop. We have to be consistent. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. Two things. One is in the question statement, somebody just wrote, "Thank you, Chantal, for sharing your truth." So it doesn't sound like a question, but I thought it was important to share. And the other response is, if people are interested in learning more about ways to engage youth, PACT does have a youth advisory council. So please feel free to reach out to us. We are very much survivors form the core of our work. At the same time, we realize that if we're reaching out to youth, we need to really engage youth. And so youth voices really play a critical role in this. And we're happy to continue that conversation. Um, all right. So, uh, Judge, you're getting some pushback on one of your comments, right? It says it's easy to change demand, but not so easy to do so. How do we more effectively move there? Oh, you're on mute.
I have to be very careful because as a judge, I have certain ethical obligations, and one of them is I cannot talk about. I limit my remarks to how do we support trafficking victims, and I don't talk about the other side. I don't talk about prosecuting the traffickers because I can't ethically. So why don't we just leave it at that for now, Laurie? Does that make
That
sense?
sounds that sounds good. Maybe Chantal, you want to weigh in on that one? You may have some feelings about it.
All right. See how the judge got me in trouble? Repeat the question, please, because I was prepared to listen, but I
Right.
could get. Mhm,
So there was a question about addressing demand, and the
mhm.
question is, it's easy to talk about addressing demand, but how do you actually do something about it? What does that look like?
That's tough, right? Now, personally, each and every one of us that's on the panel, what would you do personally to accountability? What would you do? I know what I would do. I might not know what someone else would do and stuff. The judge know what he might do that he can't say. The ambassador know what they have to do. Every one of us will have a different point of view. And maybe if we bring those point of view together, something could happen out of it, like it has been happening when it comes to the laws and knowing everything that's going from state to federal. Mental health. I am a mental health lover, fighter, protector of peace. Anyone would tell you that is something that no one could take away than what you have in here. So it's always educating your mind. What did you learn here? What did you learn? What do you learn in your career? How do you put these things together? And the wisest person is the one that gets common sense and apply that to what you're seeing. There is the internet. That is such the easiest way to get through. Do you know that my trafficker was also molested? Doesn't excuse, but some of us become victims and some of us become predators. It's so much to learn. I don't even know where to start to answer this, but I could go on and talk for days, and you guys might want to hang up. So thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
Chantal.
Laura, if I can jump in, just
Sure.
maybe not specifically on demand only, but I think one of the important truths is that in most cases, certainly in many cases, right, human trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, it's less of a crime of passion, it's a crime of economic exploitation. Um, and so, not to be sort of looking at it in kind of cold hard numbers, but in a way that is part of it. And to the extent that it pays to traffic and exploit people, there are people who have no moral compass and will do that. To the extent that it doesn't pay, or in fact it gets you into a lot of trouble, people are less likely to do it. You are never going to eliminate all trafficking. You are never going to eliminate all demand. But to the extent that we make it costly, whether in dollar terms or prison terms, for traffickers, that will be effective in reducing trafficking, not just bumping up penalties, but also making the likelihood of people getting arrested, tried, and convicted. That's even more important than sheer numbers of dollars of payment or years in prison. And I think the same thing is true on the demand side, right? If you make it more expensive, literally expensive, criminally expensive, that will have an effect on demand. It won't eliminate it. But you look at other things that are totally unrelated where we thought there's no way we'll ever do this. Think about something that's literally an addictive thing that people want to do, like smoking a cigarette, and what the kind of systemic change we've made when it comes to the tobacco industry in terms of creating financial disincentives for the tobacco companies and creating sort of social culture changes among young people. That's just one example, and that's with a product that is literally, chemically addictive, and we're able to reduce the demand for that. I think the same thing is true when we're talking about trafficking and exploitation.
It's such a great point, Aram. And one strategy that there's a growing movement in the United States is something that was pioneered originally in Scandinavia and is in effect in parts of Europe. Is called was originally the Swedish model, then the Nordic model. In the United States, it's called the equality model. Also partial decriminalization, so that the sale of sexual services is decriminalized, but the the penalties remain in place for the purchase of those services and trafficking. And what's been interesting about that is Maine now is the first state that passed that law. But in Sweden, your discussion about social norms is, I think, particularly relevant because there have been studies that have been done now in Sweden where, because those penalties, or maybe as part of a larger movement, and the penalties are part of it, are in place addressing specifically this issue of demand, that the sort of normalization of the purchase of sex has dropped significantly. So it's sort of, there's been the change in the law actually appears to have resulted in the kind of cultural shift that you mentioned. And so it'll be interesting to see as this movement continues in the United States, in states where that laws have gone into effect, will we see a change in social norms? And my hope is the answer is yes. So, uh, Aaron, maybe I can keep you on this for now. There was another question, a policy question. How do you see the funding landscape for anti-trafficking and child protection evolving over the next several years, especially in light of the past year's political priorities? In light of those trends, what strategic shifts should service providers and NGOs consider to remain effective and sustainable? And Aram, I mentioned you, but Ambassador, also, you may have recommendations on this as well. So we'd love to hear from both of you.
Sure, I can go just very quickly. The person who asked that question was someone who, like me, was one of the sort of casualties of the massive cuts to the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. So, of course, there's a lot of funding cuts. There are personnel cuts throughout government of people who do this kind of work at the State Department, all of USAID, which included anti-trafficking work. Also at HHS, DOJ, and so on. It's had a huge effect. What does that look like going forward? I think it's very hard to say, right? We're always very much captured by what is the moment, and we are 1 year into a very different turn than we were, a year and a half ago. I don't think that the cuts and the instability that are happening in this administration are permanent. I think that's the good news. I think the bad news is that this is a real wake-up call that the government is not a reliable partner, or is not necessarily a reliable partner. And there are a lot of NGOs that implement programs for the government. And I think between actual funding cuts, and simply the government or the administration refusing to fund things, rescission being an option where Congress passes an appropriation and then the president and the executive branch decide not to spend it anyway, makes being sort of wholly or substantially funded by the government much more risky than it was 18 months ago. Are there other alternatives? Yeah, I mean, I think there are other alternatives, whether that's, sort of trying to lock in funding that is government money. It's looking at the states. It's looking at philanthropies and individual donations. It's looking in some cases as fee for service, depending on what the model is. Obviously, not from trafficking victims, but depending on what kind of programs you are offering. So there are options. I don't think this sort of current landscape is going to last, but I do think it makes the ground much more shaky than it was, and I'm not totally sure how we move forward. And yes, I would love to get Ambassador Dyer's take, both as ambassador, but also someone who has been in the NGO world, working on these issues.
Well, as it will come as no surprise that I agree with everything that Aram said. And, it's similar. Not only was I at the Trafficking Persons Office, but many years ago, I was at the Office on Violence Against Women. And both of those offices give grant money. Office on Violence Against Women gives it only to local US-based NGOs, and the Trafficking Persons gave it only to foreign. It was coming from different funding, and both of those offices have had significant funding cuts. And I share Aram's thought that I do think that it will not be as bad as it is right now going forward, but I also am worried that it's not going to go back the way that it was. And this causes me to think about some of the things that I have seen abroad and overseas. I mentioned earlier that sometimes, necessity is the mother of invention. And some of the NGOs that I worked with in other countries did a better job out of necessity because there were no social services that you could rely on. There is no SNAP, there is no housing, there's no HUD, there's no, even children's health care. So the NGOs were really focused on making sure that survivors had a skill and an ability to support themselves and their children going forward, even more so, I think, sometimes than US NGOs do. Similarly, those NGOs themselves, almost every NGO that is operating, especially in countries that are pretty low economics, they almost all offered some sort of small business enterprise that they used to bring in some of their money. And there are US organizations that are doing that with different levels and abilities. One, I was affiliated with an organization, Genesis Women's Shelter in Dallas, and they have the best thrift store that you have ever seen. Of course, they're in Dallas. You got to play to your strengths, folks. I mean, if you're living someplace where that's not, don't do what doesn't work in your locale, but taking advantage of Dallas, they have the best thrift store. I personally shop there every time I go to Dallas, and they get at least 10% of their operating funds every year from that thrift store. And it's also beneficial because they have a thrift store. So survivors who flee a domestic violence situation in the middle of the night with their kids, they can get access. They can have clothing. If they move, they can kind of shop and get furniture at the shelter. So that's one example. Others are doing a really good job with local businesses having like nights that support them. But I do think that we are having to lean more into these. It's not what I wanted. It's kind of like the amazing women leaders that I worked with overseas. They would have loved to have HUD and SNAP and CHIP. But in the absence of those things, they worked with what they had. And unfortunately, I feel like we're going to have to take a little bit of a page out of their book and be more creative.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Martina Vandenberg, who, Aram, you mentioned her really important research. She's indicated here research conducted by Wilmer Hale and the Human Trafficking Legal Center indicated that mandatory restitution is only ordered in 27% of cases with a conviction or guilty plea when it should be 100%. And this question is for Ambassador Dyer and for Chantal. Ambassador Dyer, as a former prosecutor, why do you think that prosecutors are not requesting restitution? Judge Camacho, you too. So, Judge Camacho, have you seen victims receive restitution in New York courts? And Chantal, did you receive restitution in your case? Do you know of any survivors who received restitution? Would it have helped to have had a pro bono attorney? And as the moderator, I'm going to reserve the right to add some comments at the end of this section as well.
For my part, I'll say not once, not ever. Doesn't happen here in New York State.
In Texas, I'll say that we as prosecutors, we typically asked for restitution. We always asked for restitution, but we very rarely got it, or we got a small amount less than what we asked for. And the reason was, at least this is, and Judge Camacho, I would love to have been in his court as opposed to the folks that I was. But frequently, especially if you have a defendant who's going to jail, judges feel like, well, how can I make him pay money when I'm sending him to jail and preventing him from working? Now, what I wanted was take the money out of his bank account, make him sell his house, make him sell his car that's all stupid looking anyway. And the judges frequently say, well, no, because that'll harm I feel bad for his wife and his kids, or I feel bad, his mother lives there. And so what I saw was if I wanted restitution in a case, I almost had to agree to probation, because if he was working, the judges were willing to give a high amount of restitution. But if he was going to the penitentiary, and I'm sorry, I'm using gendered language, most of the time it was a male perpetrator, but not always. But if they were going to go to jail, they were very reluctant for those reasons. And of course, they're busy hiding assets just as quick as they can. And it was so frustrating. And I love the idea. I do think that the best way to get money restitution for victims, it should be in the criminal court. But I observed more likelihood of getting restitution in the civil courts, but that requires an attorney. You don't get one for free like you do at the DA's office. And so the service that Martina is doing is just amazing, but we shouldn't have to use a civil attorney in every case to get restitution. It should be easier, and it is super frustrating that it's not.
Restitution was mentioned, and the amount was embarrassing. I think a Metro card costs more. So I don't know. I didn't get it though, But I would be positive that the only thing consistent in life is change. And as this panel has showed domestically and globally, that this awareness is putting a dent, a damage, and is opening everybody's minds to this demand. So it's not going to last forever. This accountability that's starting to happen is very strong and powerful. And I'm so grateful that everyone here is going to be a part of it. Everyone in this room that came to see this, that came to learn, that came to add on to what they already know. So, but I ain't got no money, y'all. I'm still waiting. I'm open to any suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. Yeah, and to add to that from my own experience, as Martina knows, I had represented a number of victims of trafficking in federal cases where we asked for and received significant orders of restitution, like as high as $2 million. But my clients have not seen a penny of it. And Ambassador, it's for the reasons that you mentioned, much of the money has been laundered. And if that money has been laundered overseas, it's almost impossible to have access to those funds. So I think it's important that we do think about what is not only the percentage, which this report indicates it's quite low, but what does meaningful restitution look like and how is it enforceable? We are almost at time. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists if you have any short, like closing remarks, reflections from this conversation. And I want to thank all the people who put in wonderful questions, and my apologies that we couldn't answer everything, but these is a really substantive conversation. Maybe we'll start in reverse order, Ambassador, if you don't mind.
I want to give just a quick shout out, first of all, to the hosts for having this panel discussion. Thank you also for including such a good perspective. I am so grateful to you for having Chantal on. As always, I learned so much from survivor leaders and experts. I want to thank the people who participated in this call. Right now, I think it is so important for all of us who care about the issue of human trafficking to really be loud and proud about it. And the more diverse fields we come from and the more diverse political backgrounds that we come from, the better. It is very important at a time when there is very little that folks on different sides of the aisle can agree on, that we maintain the importance of combating human trafficking as something that all Americans agree on, no matter what political persuasion, no matter your faith, no matter your job. This is something that we can all agree on. It is so important that we maintain the bipartisan support. So many thanks to all of you for helping us do that. Thanks to the hosts and thanks to these amazing co-panelists who are my new friends. And I've got your emails, so y'all better look out. Thanks again.
Thank you. Aram. Oh no, who is next? Oh no, Judge, you were next in the lineup. Sorry. See, I would be a bad baseball coach, Judge.
Yeah, so thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. You know, I talk a lot about survival leaders and how they inspire me. Somebody else inspires me too, those that didn't survive. And I want to think about them. I've been ending every time I speak with this letter that I wrote. I almost gave this work up a number of years ago because I couldn't take it anymore. It hurts. And so I wrote a letter to myself that I always read before I speak. And it's very short. It's from Erin, who I lost the first one, 16-year-old lost on my watch many years ago. Dear Judge, I heard you cried when you learned of my death. Let me help dry your tears. You cared about me. You helped me. You believed in me. You did not judge me. You respected my dignity. You did not dismiss me as a bad girl. Most of all, you don't forget about me. Don't mourn me or feel pity for me. I mattered. I was important. I made a difference in your life. I changed you. I inspired you. Every time you speak to a group of kids about the dangers of life, I am at your side. When you address community groups to raise awareness of trafficking in our neighborhoods, I am there. I'm whispering in your ear. Every time you look into the eyes of a trafficking victim, you're looking at them through my eyes and I'm smiling. When you go to Albany and speak to legislators to advocate for services, I am making your voice louder. Please stop feeling sad when you think of me as you read my letter. I am here on this podium helping you to carry on my message and inspiring others to continue to fight for trafficking victims. Love, Erin.
Thanks, Judge. It's hard to follow that. I would say on the policy side, there is some reason for hope, and there's incredible cynicism about the political process in the United States, and for very, very good reason. I will say that as Ambassador Dyer suggested, the trafficking issues are some of the very, very, very few substantive areas of law where there can be real across the aisle work, and there almost always is. Virtually I think every anti-trafficking bill in Congress has strong Democratic and Republican support. There are some very weird dynamics, but they tend to, on this issue, be more between the House and Senate, and it's more turf than it is ideology. So things like, for example, you had near or close to unanimous passage of the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, the Epstein Transparency Act. There was a lot of wrangling, but on the substantive vote, it was essentially unanimous. The Stop CSAM bill that I mentioned earlier, it hasn't gone through Congress yet, but interestingly enough, it passed the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously. It's stuck in the House Judiciary Committee, but it's a House Senate issue. Similarly, on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act reauthorization, versions of that bill have passed essentially unanimously, the Senate and the House, two Congresses ago, last Congress, and we may end up in the same thing where it hasn't become law, but it's again a House Senate issue. So there is actual room for movement. And I will say the other thing that I think is worth noting is that whereas Congress generally is sort of generationally behind the times, there is a lot of attention being paid to online exploitation, which does seem like the new frontier. I think Congress is never going to be up to where the tech is, but the tech is also evolving very rapidly. But whether you look at accountability in the courts in terms of the meta trials in Los Angeles and now New Mexico, or some of the bills that would focus on online trafficking and exploitation, there is real interest in trying to move forward with that, as imperfect as it is. So some reasons to hope, and also some reasons I hope for our participants to, as much as they can, get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Aram. I really appreciate that. And also thank you for your optimism. It's very appreciated. Chantal, you get to have the closing remarks.
I have nothing else to say because I am so honored to be here with everyone and to hear the difference and what they have been through, what they have seen, and what we're going to do different. And everyone here is from a different walk of life, domestically and globally. Let's keep on putting a dent to the demand. Let's do damage, okay? So that demand question could be answered by each and every one of us. So I really appreciate this time, and I appreciate everybody in here. Judge Camacho, you ain't gonna try to make me cry, but I love it. And I thank everyone for coming, showing up, and showing out. And we thank you. And this Vandenberg, my son is Vandenberg too. So I'm like, wait, is she family? But that money she talking about, that civil, I thank you. I learned something new myself. And I'm honored. I thank you guys. And we hope we have the opportunity again for us to work together for a greater good. And have a blessed day. Bye.
Thank you all. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone again. And this concludes our webinar.